Thanks, everyone. I appreciate you all coming here. When I first signed up, there you go, perfect. Sorry, multimedia presentations. Yes, I'm the new Prime Minister of England. No, sorry. When I first signed up to this topic, I thought, great, I'll talk about Zero Trust, and I had something special in mind. And then I started to do a bunch of additional research, and my research kind of uncovered, probably what was 4,000 slides on the topic and reams and reams of volumes. And then I found out, like most IT specialists, what you don't know about the topic. And then I did more research and found out how I whittle this down. So I'm going to go through a bit of a whirlwind about what Zero Trust is here and how Microsoft, at least in my past, I used to work for Microsoft, looks at it and how you look at it a little bit more from an industry perspective. There we go. A bit of an agenda, so I'll skip through this a little bit, but I'm going to cover off some of these areas. I have PDF the slides, so sometime over the next couple of days, I will make sure it gets uploaded. And there are some, hidden slides that I'm not going to go through today with like 1,001 links, because every time I found something I thought useful, geez, I'm going to include this. No, I'm going to just give you a bunch of reading material later if you want. For my sins, I've been around a fair while. Some big companies. I guess the most recent big company was Microsoft for 12 and a half years. Right now, I'm doing some independent consulting. You have money, hire me, I'll do the right thing. By the way, I'm a very bad consultant because I really don't want people to use my services if they don't get value. So I try to talk myself out of most consulting jobs. Because I think, I'll tell you the truth, most people actually know what they need to do. What they need is consultants to really kind of cover what they thought they needed to do so that they can justify it. It's all about that. So if you know what you need to do, happy to come and maybe clarify some thoughts and get on with it. So the objectives for today are really about simplifying cloud security and what Zero Trust is. So there's a bunch of simple principles which most people in security just kind of gloss over, and they get down into the nitty-gritty technical details. If you keep your eye on that prize, that'll be good. Fundamentals of Zero Trust. Most people just skip past those fundamentals, and I don't memorize things very well. What I do is go back to the first principles and then go, oh yeah, that's how they align. So that's there. Really, why Zero Trust is a better model, and I'm going to go through that, and then kind of understanding how to think about those things as it applies to Azure, and then a little bit about hybrid cloud. And there's that other A cloud. No one's ever heard of it, have they? No? I'm going to mention them here in the presentation at the end. By the way, this is not intended to be a complete compendium of all of the security aspects, because if I did that, then we just never leave. So you can, we'll leave some time for questions, or maybe we can do that after Simon's, if it's open here. So this is my, oh, Simon's chatting online there. If there are questions or something.
I'll just ask here. We'll take the questions on the chat.
Yeah. By the way, I really don't like the sound of my own voice. So if people have some questions, or let's make this as interactive as possible. There is no right or wrong presentation. There's only the presentation that you find valuable. So if you have any questions, just shout them out. If we're not going to make it in time, I'll just skip over some other slides. Yeah. This is kind of my idea of the way we look at infrastructure and security and the way things are now, is you have that kind of wide moat. You sort of put all your stuff in that castle. You protect it like crazy. But today we're in this era of drones. Did everyone see that new announcement that we're going to end up having the Switchblade drones yesterday, the military? Oh, yeah. Yeah. There's all these new drones that everybody is doing. Of course, you know about various places in the world. Well, now Australia is going to be drone mad in the army, which is perhaps fantastic, because that's the era of security that we're in. And from that perspective, if you look at your data and your infrastructure security from an IT perspective or an IS perspective, really, there is no place that's safe. What there is places where if they get hit, it's not going to spread elsewhere, right? Because drones are not dropping, obviously, munitions here. They're dropping in, access, or they're dropping in the capability to steal data or what have you, right? And so, you should almost have like those helicopters that reach down and claw and pick up your data and then run away with it or something. This is kind of the way I think about the difference in security that we oftentimes don't really hear much about. So this is a slide that I created because I started to look at all of these different acronyms. Does anybody know all of these acronyms that are on this slide? No, neither. Surprisingly enough, coming back to my bad memory, I didn't know what all of these meant as first as well. You'll see some of these, and I have them in a follow-up slide later on. But Z is zero, T is trust, C is cloud, N usually is network. But the fact is that everybody markets their own security based on what they have, and they have all these great common terms. When you boil it down, it's just relatively straightforward, and that's the kind of key thing that people miss out on. So zero trust, this is a thought process that's been around for a number of decades. First proposed in 1994. That's a long time ago. Who was in IT in 1994? Few of you, well, at least one. But it is basically all about sort of three very simple principles. Verify explicitly. That's a pretty broad term, but when I'm doing something, I should know what I'm doing. I should know where I'm doing it, how I'm doing it. Like, you kind of walk down and blindly kind of stumble over a crack in the sidewalk, or you run into a lamppost because you're reading your phone, or, people driving these days getting camera fines. But they're not driving explicitly. They're not aware. So you think that kind of verify explicitly? I think it's about awareness. What are you trying to do? What is this thing trying to do? What is happening? Apply least privileges. I heard earlier on, Michael in the back, he was, I'm going to pick on you, Michael. All the new, since I left Microsoft, there's been a bunch more additional security because data leakage happens. The next thing I would never take anything, but I'll just say this, is that without fine-grained capability, you end up with the data leakage coming out and basically least privileges. Am I getting access to what I need to get access to and not to other things that I don't need to get access to? I'm sure everybody's had that. Who's had an experience where that's happened? Come on. Yeah, get access to somebody else's SharePoint or whatever. Let's go have a look at that. What's this project on? Yeah, project terminate all people. No, sorry, project going out of business. And then assume breach. Yeah, I'm sure everybody in here has their best intention and has a halo above their head. The fact is this: you might have a halo above your head, but the person beside you might not. And your opinion of a halo might be different than somebody's, thorny crown with devil horns or something out of it. One person's halo is another person's horns, right? So if you look at that, these are the three principles that you just have to be clear-eyed about. Oh, sorry, go back. There we go. Now, when you're looking at that, people have, or customers, companies, businesses, they pretty much have two models of security. One where they anchor everything to a network. And I personally call that network-centric security. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But the key element to think about that is, if it's on my network, or if it's on the network I know, then I must know what the security of that is. That's that first big castle with a moat. Because my network is inside the castle, and of course, the castle is separated by this moat, we call them, maybe a bridge with a firewall or whatever the case is, but we have that in place. We can secure that. No longer really that possible in any modern network or modern environment. And then zero trust. And zero trust is, again, really about a defense in depth strategy. It's about understanding your environment. And I'll go through that. There's a phrase called DAS. Yeah, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So myths about zero trust. Yeah. It's not about not trusting. That's where everyone says, oh, zero trust. Oh, I can't trust anything. Well, you're going to trust somebody. First of all, you trust your hardware provider. Yeah, even if you actually get these things where it loads up and it validates it, you still end up trusting your certificates. You end up trusting things. It's about really verifying. Zero trust is really a misnomer. It's about verifying, is this somebody that I can work with? Is this entity applicable that I'm not, suitable to the risk? If I'm building a protected level or a top secret network or a top secret environment, it's totally different than an item that is not top secret. Yeah, you end up having less controls, less specific areas. You trust wider because you got to get stuff done. Microsegmentation. This is another key concept that everyone talks about. I've got to put something on a network and I've got to microsegment it, and I can only have these two things talking, but I can't talk over here because I got to go through another firewall. And so you see these, and how many people have like 400 firewalls in their environment? Come on. I know you do. You're all laughing. If you don't have 400 firewalls, you have 400 ACLs, and then you have 400, NSGs and whatever the case is. NSGs, firewall, they're not bad. But you ever see this where you end up having a firewall and the traffic that flows right through it is encrypted and the firewall goes, 443, it's straight through. Must be safe. Yeah? Who does that? I know you guys are laughing. You're just thinking about it. You're just not ready to talk up. And then marketing. Zero trust, I found out, surprisingly enough, you can go into the academic research and zero down into a bunch of stuff. Man, zero trust is a marketing term. Everybody has their take on zero trust. And I have a product for you because I've done zero trust. Those other people. But let me tell you my zero trust product, and it's going to solve all your problems. That is what happens. Sorry. Let me go there. So zero trust and vendors. I did a bit of research on this Forrester, and if I've abused the Forrester research, I apologize. I'm a single consultant, so I just ripped off their slide. Probably should be copyrighted. Please don't report me. I'll follow the grace of the Azure user group in general. But there's just a bunch of things that these, Gartner and Forrester and analysts all use, and they say, hey, these are the better zero trust solutions and not what have you. You look at it, and I read through the report in detail, and they all do different things. If I am, Palo Alto, every zero trust problem is a firewall. Yeah. If I'm, Checkpoint, it's got to be some sort of VPN capability. If it's, something else. Zero trust. If you come to me and then say, hey, I want to implement zero trust, and you say, I'm going to use this product because it does zero trust. I know you don't know what's going on, because really zero trust is a mentality about the way you think and how you look at end-to-end security from a component perspective. But there's lots of good things in here. And by the way, when you're looking at zero trust, you're not really ever finished. Is security ever finished? Has everyone heard that farmer and the goat story? No? There's actually a few kind of white papers that talk about that. But the farmer and the goat, if the farmer tries to keep the goat in, but only has a limited amount of time to put the fence up and figure out what they're doing. Because they have to do other farming things. The goat sits there and looks at that fence forever, and it will always find a way out. Why? Because it knows every weakness, and it's going to go through that weakness, and whatever that weakness is. And so hackers are like that. And so instead of worrying about, everything just through a farm or a goat lens, what you need to do is to figure out, maybe there should be another thing outside the fence that keeps the goat somewhere on your property, or whatever the case is. So what you should do when you're looking at a product or you're looking at something for Zero Trust is you should look at what is right for you to anchor, to be the primary, and I'll say this, kind of concept about how you're going to implement or typically look at Zero Trust. And Microsoft looks at Zero Trust with identity. Identity is the key lens through what Microsoft look at for Zero Trust. So here, Microsoft, and this is a little Microsoft diagram. Basically, if there's one thing I'm going to leave here today, and I'll get back to this a more number of times, is identity, identity, identity. And I'll hammer through this in a few different ways in a second, but basically, Microsoft does everything with identity, and then things revolve around that. And we'll talk about that as we go through. And so whether it's role-based access control or other things, application access. So this is the way I look at Zero Trust. This is my personal slide. And I break down every problem into this kind of model because I'm a simple person. I really kind of look at things and say, I have an entity A and an entity B, and they need to communicate. So the first thing I do is secure them. If I can secure them, if they're within my control, I do whatever in that I secure them, whether that's your database and you secure your database, or you do your data encryption, or whatever the things are you're going to do. I'll talk about those protections, but I secure them. And then they have to communicate. If they're inside my data center and they're right next to one another, and maybe I have a trusted piece of copper between them, great. Just let them talk. The Zero Trust isn't about not trusting. It's about knowing who you should trust and who you shouldn't trust. But then you end up with this thing where you go, oh my Lord, I have this untrusted network in between us. Great thing for another capability in technology, encryption and VPN and SSL, TLS, all those wonderful acronyms. And then, of course, this is where we don't throw out the firewalls all the time. Maybe there's some of these things that you have which are an untrusted item talking to a trusted item. Web servers, applications that are on the internet, what have you, that untrusted thing might be a device. It could be a mobile handheld client. It could be a laptop. It could be a website, whatever the case is. This is where you take and look at all of the great stuff that our friends that make firewalls and what I would call packet manglers do. Nothing wrong with packet mangler. I'm all loving those guys. But the fact is this, is you don't have to use them all the time. If it's all SSL straight through, don't worry about it. How many people have SSL all the way through to their web server? Fantastic. Do you break the chain and maybe have the packet be expected in the middle?
Not in our control.
Not in your controls.
Yeah, we do.
You do? Why?
Because we're not trusting the traffic.
Correct. And you shouldn't trust that traffic, maybe, right? But the fact is this, is that you end up with something that's talking through here, and you might end up having a break in the chain, you unwrap the packet, you trust your firewall, because guess what? It's a trusted device. Hold on a second here. We're talking about Zero Trust. We said Zero Trust. You can't trust the firewall. Of course you can. It's the thing you can trust, because it's yours. It's on the inside. They're connected by another piece of copper. I didn't draw it in here. Next. Yeah. why I kind of love these words, zero trust. It's just sometimes, the way things happen. So let's talk about how Microsoft looks at these things, right? And some of the Microsoft security architecture bits. No questions yet, Sam? Nobody stood there and said, my God, Reid, you're talking absolute crap. Okay, good. Anyone heard of the fourth wall? Kind of this acting term where you're doing a play upstage. I'm kind of doing a play right now, and everyone's happy. You're just watching. I know you're very chatty. You haven't really spoken to me. And people are saying, well, what happened? And then the actors interact with the audience. They break that fourth wall and bring the audience into the play. It's a very kind of, theatrical term. Azure has a fourth wall. We rarely talk about it. Guess what? You're not the only one running something on Azure. Everybody has their next door neighbor. Microsoft does a lot of things to prevent the noisy neighbor syndrome or make sure that the data doesn't leak from one to the other. But we're running on shared infrastructure. Microsoft doesn't run a separate piece of copper every time a new application is stood up, right? This is virtualization. We're all happy sometimes when we're running VMware in our office and we have it then say, well, then we move this, we can't move that to the cloud. My God, it's going to be impacted or seriously hacked or whatever the case is. It's as secure if you make it as secure as it is on your VMware environment. It's a hypervisor. These things are rated for protected level or secret, whatever the case is. I'm sure there's configurations, but yeah, the fourth wall, you have to be aware of it. And sometimes Microsoft allows you to connect things across that, different customers together. Right? You do it deliberately. Think about that as we go through. So I'm going to blast through the next couple of slides a little bit faster because Microsoft has this thing, and this is a bit of an older diagram that I've presented many times, and that is really about the layers that are used in various access methodologies and how you should look at the different planes of management. So you end up having this privilege and access plane at the top. That's identity, right? Most people don't understand, but that maps to, it used to be called AAD. I apologize. I did some updates to Entra, but you're going to see AAD and Entra sort of interchangeably here. They couldn't be asked to change every slide all the time. There's control plane. Talk about that a little bit more. Management plane, the data plane, and then this user access capability, which is where you're using things. And we're going to come back to this. And Microsoft have made recently some big announcements, you might talk about them, where they're going to enforce you to, when you access these things, to be authenticated. And MFA, not just authenticated, MFA. I'll talk about that in a moment. So let's just pull back a moment and talk about the fact is that Microsoft in their cloud environments use identity everywhere. Yeah? Why don't they let you use somebody else's identity? Because they don't trust it. So they force you to have an Entra account. It could be a free Entra account. That's fine. You sign up to your M365 or your Office 365 or Azure or whatever the case is, and sometimes you pay and you get P1 a little bit for free. Everyone knows those types of terms. But interestingly enough, there are SaaS applications that are intricately linked to their services, and the roles are defined, and the permissions are all kind of there, and the definitions. And so all you do is just kind of add people to the right role, and away it goes. It already knows how to do that stuff. But in Azure, what's your application look like? Simon, your application, does it fit exactly onto everyone else's application? No. Some people have a 3-tier model. Some people have some sort of distributed thing. Some people are running on different great stuff, containers, and all sorts of different stuff. And so how do I know what the roles and how they map to your application? Well, you have to do that. Because guess what? You're responsible for what the application looks like here. So part of thinking through zero trust and whole thing is to figure out what your security should look like based on what those roles look like. And so until recently, the last say 2.5 years, maybe a little longer than that, 3 years, Microsoft rarely ever had or promoted as a separate cloud entity its identity as a service. For years, I used to talk to customers when I was at Microsoft and say, guess what? There's a cloud in the middle. When you talk about Azure and people talk about Office 365, and they might pull out Dynamics, they say, oh, we've got all these cloud properties, but they don't talk about the identity as a service. Microsoft's identity as a service cloud, now called Entra, is absolutely a cornerstone to everything they do. And you should understand that. And if you want to do your security, the more you learn about Entra, and it has a great lot of services, and we can talk about them. This isn't an Entra talk, so I'm not going to dive into it deep, but if another takeaway, learn Entra. Don't have you understand that. So with that, Azure then segments itself. Remember we talked about micro segmentation? Let's talk about macro segmentation first. Microsoft then says you want to use Azure? We're going to macro segment you into something called a subscription. Who's heard of enrollment, the word enrollment? Yeah, everyone? What do you get with an enrollment? Nothing. You get the ability to buy. Fantastic. It's like your credit card. Where things live, if you want a service, is in a subscription. A subscription is the boundary between you and your neighbor. It's where a lot of the permissions all land, right? That's how that stuff works. You know, an enrollment is how you get billed. Entra is how permissions flow down. You'll see in a second. But a subscription is the key boundary. So just coming back here, this is kind of a, most people just assume that they know this stuff. But if you look at it, coming back to the previous slide, you end up having with a data and workload plane, all that stuff is above this magic layer that hides all of the complexity below it. And there's a lot of complexity. So let's talk about trust again. This is zero trust. Gotta love that word. Zero trust. We're not going to trust our service. Of course we have to trust Microsoft. They make the very existence of the worlds that you guys put your data into. You have to trust them. Right? So that's what a resource provider is, how they create the world or the bubble that you live in. This is like putting on those, virtual reality goggles. Everyone got the, Meta Quest or whatever they are, and you're living in a VR. You're in, an Azure reality world. And that's kind of how this stuff works. And the more you learn about those things, and there are reams and reams of documentation for that, then the more you're going to understand how the security and the security that you apply, all based on how they create this. So from an overall perspective, you end up having your subscriptions, and you happily go and think, hey, guess what? I've got my stuff and I'm totally secure because I plugged my stuff into this virtual network, and that virtual network's mine. Running on a shared network, it's running through the resource providers, it's going through a bunch of different manglers all the way through to keep A, you're separate, and B, they protect themselves from you guys. I protect me from them as well. I use them. So that's kind of ARM. And we end up having a bunch of details around the resource providers. Any questions on, has anyone not heard of resource providers? You can literally go and knock them out and load them up. And, there are preview examples. Are those new to you? Everyone knows that? This is Azure User Group, right? Okay, I won't bother talking about that stuff. Interestingly enough, though, when it comes to this, again, security model, you look at it, the identity is all about used for authentication. And where Microsoft has really made strides is actually doing some of the authorization. Azure AD, now called Entra, didn't used to do too much authorization in Azure. Because what used to happen is you were given an identity, and I used to talk to customers forever about saying, hey, guess what? We are going to do some authentication, and then where do you put all your authorization? What's the four-letter acronym?
Okay.
RBAC. Where do RBAC things live?
I am.
Well, they live actually attached to, associated with the resource. In Azure, they're associated with the resource. But now, more and more, as Entra is starting to put its tentacles out, you can actually put in different properties inside the identity, and it can have influenced those authorizations, right? Conditional access is a good example of where authorization happens because you are you're using conditional access. You actually have a property, you come in from a certain location, you're rejected or approved, whatever the case is. But in Azure, you have to, and in security, you should know where your authorization comes from and where your identity, is authenticated with. Anyone know? Well, I know some of you know me, but where I'm originally from. You come and people hear my accent.
North of England.
North of England, exactly. Yeah. I used to go around and talk to different customers, security-based organizations, and then you say, hey, guess what? This is my ID. And they would look at it and say, oh, what do you mean this is from New South Wales? We don't trust that stuff in South Australia. What do you mean? Authentication rejected. Oh, we accept this ID as New South Wales, but you're still not coming in because your authorization's been rejected. We don't like you. That's the difference, right? Authentication is who you are. Authorization is what you can do. So I'm not going to go through too much about RBAC, except to say that there's a bunch of things on inheritance. You can have a scope. They are, you don't have to start to make a bunch of different permission settings, except they just all flow down. And we can talk about that, and you can go through and make role definitions and be very precise. So if you want more on those things, I'll let you look them up. But it's important if you're going to secure Azure to do that stuff well and to think about it. And guess what? It's gotten a lot better because it used to be, I don't know, 6-7 years ago, there was very few roles. Now there's like 4 billion roles. Everyone figure that out? You look at the role definitions now and like, holy smokes, just page after page after page. A little bit of a denied assignment about how you can do that as well. There we go. So let's move on to Microsoft's approach. Coming back to what I said before, Microsoft's zero trust approach, or let's just call it security approach, is identity. I had earlier versions of the slide where I'm just going to put identity, 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 identity. Oh, and then RBAC, RBAC, data encryption, network, maybe. But primarily, it's all about identity. And identity is how things revolve around. And so this is kind of directly from one of their websites. So this is, again, just liberally, or like most consultants from the public documentation. It's common today, isn't it? Could be. A little bit about those things you see, identities, and if you kind of flow through this type of stuff, you'll find that all things kind of eventually lead to being authenticated. Let me come back to that. So here's a good slide kind of thing that I came across, which has these wonderful 12 steps, to implementing zero trust. Awesome. And all of them are things that make absolute sense. I'm going to show you a slide in a few minutes, in another minute or two, which then shows you how many products and things that you start to choose from. Just before I go into that, I just wanted to highlight, this is not a Microsoft thing. This is from the Cloud Security Alliance. There's a group, who's heard of the Cloud Security Alliance, CSA? Yeah, awesome. They have this, but it's kind of more on that open source Azure Trust things, but this term DAS, Data Application Assets and Services. And if you look at cross-platform, hybrid implementation, or I should say thinking about Zero Trust, you should identify your assets, you should identify your data, identify the applications and the services, and then look at that from that, again, verify explicitly, those kind of principles that are part of that. And of course, you can't have a security presentation without the CIA triad. Got to be there, right? But in this day and age, I think we're just going to throw out integrity, because I don't think most of the politicians these days, do they have integrity come out of their mouth? That's okay. Don't be people that lie more than politicians, maybe our consultants. Hopefully not me. This, I was going to go through and let this build, but it took a long time. These are all, and this was one of the later ones that I found, all of the things that Microsoft has, and if you kind of look in here, various elements about how they do their security. So if you want to know how to do security on Microsoft and you're unsure, just one slide, right? Just go ahead and implement it. Doesn't really help you too much, does it? It's amazing, because every time you end up looking at this, you go, oh, guess what? There's a thing here that they could have used, or what have you. So there's all sorts of little solutions, little services, little point stuff that allow you to get a thing done. And then Microsoft has this new kind of methodology, or what I would say, services that they are starting to sell and promote, called CNAP. Yeah, the cloud network, or cloud native application capability. So again, this is them bundling up Defender and saying, oh, we can look at your Defender for AWS. Who's tried that? Anyone? No. What happens if your data on your blob storage is encrypted? Can Defender look at it? Have you given Defender the keys to your kingdom so they can decrypt it? Should you? Is that zero trust? I don't know. Zero trust, again, comes back to what you should and shouldn't do. Is that what you need to do? Do you trust that service to be part of that kind of capability? And that's kind of where you see a lot of these things. You look at a lot of these services. Microsoft assumes when you deploy zero trust, you expect that you trust Microsoft, because you can't get things done if you don't trust anybody. So you have to kind of move forward with these things. So you can deploy this. In the end, you got to kind of take some practical aspects of actually moving forward. So how do you do that? They've got some first top 10 principles, and I love the Microsoft top 10 principles, and I've not talked a lot about this, and that is a lot about operationalizing your secure score. There are whole piles of operational things that you should be doing. If you're not doing them, shame on you. If you're doing them, do them better. Because most of the security stuff is really operational in nature. Actually putting in place the elements of the controls is relatively straightforward. You see passwordless or MFA for admins. There's a slide later on I'll show you where Microsoft have made an announcement. you will do MFA if you're going to access the Azure Resource Manager control plane. The first thing is you're going to get it slammed on you when you access the portal. And then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to get it slammed in it when you access it with a command line. And the third thing is, guess what? All your APIs is going to have that too whenever you access these things. And so you better have certificates. And if you don't, tough luck. Why would they do that? We'll come back to that in a moment. Look at all these other things. Enable threat protection. Looks like they're going to start to sell their services. Assign and choose a firewall strategy. I'm sure they're not going to recommend Palo Alto. Web application firewall and DDoS. Cloudflare, anybody? No? So you can look at some of those links there. Let me talk about how I look at it, because I'm a really simple person. I really like to keep it simple. First of all, focus on the core things. I just kind of wind back and say, guess what? Always verify. That doesn't mean you don't trust somebody. I trust you. But I'm going to just verify. Are you going to be here on time? Of course you are. Everyone has those kind of follow up, right? You send your friend a meeting reminder or whatever the case is. Always verify. Least privileges. Even though I worked in this area for 3.5 years in this office and Microsoft for 12, guess what? They still didn't let me in the door. I had to be verified. I have a badge. I have a business badge. And always assume breach, right? They're never going to let me just in the room. Identity. There's a white paper that I have a reference to. Microsoft estimates that you can get a 98.5 to 99.5% reduction overall of the possibilities of being breached if you implement MFA. That's amazing. So, out of 7, I think the paper talked about 7 million instance breaches that they talked about in their research, because they have all the data behind, their identity service. There were 7 million breaches. Only, I think it was 15,000 of them actually had MFA of any sort turned on. And then if you kind of have MFA implemented properly, it goes down further. And so 7 million compared to 15,000 is a big decrease, right? We're talking worldwide stats. And then you end up with like next to none if you have better versions of MFA. SMS is not as good as, your app. It's not as good as Face ID or other things. So when you look at that, there's a good white paper on that, and it's in one of the links that I have. Azure policy, yeah, we should just apply it and enable it. You can pull down. I know you guys in the back there have just pulled down and just dropped it on. Great. Pick your preferred, NIST or CSM or whatever the case is, and just deploy it. It's probably the way to go. Network security. Everybody gets wired about network. If you're using SSL, your data is encrypted, you don't have to have necessarily every part of the OSI stack encrypted. Does that mean that you have to have, I'm encrypting at the layer 2 level, then I'm going to have another encryption at layer 3, and then I'm going to have another encryption at layer 4, and you end up with 4 layers of encryption. You ever see those people? Wow. Holy smokes. Sometimes having the ability to communicate, but make sure that you're doing it with the other person that you know is there. Mutual TLS. How many people have implemented mutual TLS? You know what mutual TLS is? It's where I have a public and private key, and I validate you, and you got the certificate, and I've got a certificate. So we're exchanging that and saying, hey, guess what? I know that you're the one talking to me. It's basic cryptography, right? But I use my security and you use your security, so we know that we can't literally be spooked in the middle. And then if you try to have a man-in-the-middle attack, guess what? Oh, I've been hacked. Right? If somebody's tried to siphon stuff off, I'm not going to accept that. I know that that packet or that thing is not possible. As soon as you start to get that in the middle, and you start to take your packet and your firewall and then unencrypt it and then re-encrypt it, you have more certificates and more hassle. Just have two devices again, coming back to that model, figure that out. Obviously, data security. Most people, they put their stuff in a database and then they don't encrypt the data. Keys, endpoints. I'm not a desktop person, but I just kind of hopefully apply various, MDM solutions, and away you go. Everybody using Intune? No, not a salesperson for Intune, but it's a pretty reasonable thing. And then obviously your infrastructure. Good architecture, a good design architecture will go a long way to being a better security model. If you have some complicated thing, and I'll show you a case study in a moment, where you end up with people that had bad architecture, man, does it get difficult. This is that white paper, almost getting to the end of this. You will be using MFA if you're using Azure. If you're not using MFA now, expect it to come. I think the portal stuff is already implemented for most people, or a lot of it.
As been refined for years.
Yeah, well, if you already have MFA, you already have.
I thought this is already in place earlier, but yeah.
I think they punted it till July now,
Right.
and then let me just say this: the noose is being incrementally tightened. Noose, is that a bad? Maybe it's a bad analogy. The rack, you're being stretched. Let's quickly go through a couple of case studies. So these are kind of some real world things that I worked on, and I have removed the name, so I'm not going to talk to you. But there's a customer that had an on-premises application. They're a security company, or have a security requirement, and they need to upload data because they needed more storage space. They wanted scalable storage to Azure. What types of things would we look at in this type? Now, I drew these diagrams, so I know the thing, but where would you look at this from a zero trust perspective? Where do you start? Yeah, you start from, well, lots of different places, but I started from the very top with subscription. You build that subscription, and then you look at making sure that's secure. And then you end up, and I've not shown all the things in here, resource groups, permissions, and then you build, you deploy the various componentry, and you make sure they're there. But look at, you automatically are trusting the environment. Is this actually going to work? It does. When you have this private endpoint, everybody loves to say, I've got a private endpoint, so I must not, everything must be on my VNet. Really? No, you can actually have a private endpoint and a public endpoint or a service endpoint on one of your on your resource. There's nothing to say that this resource isn't also communicating elsewhere, and it's absolutely possible to do. You've got to make sure you configure it properly. So just because you have a private endpoint, people say, oh, great, I've got a private endpoint and I've got my firewall and away I go, and guess what? Nothing more to see here. Wrong approach, right? You have to look at these things holistically. What's flowing through here? Guess what? This application had to have encryption turned on because originally the customer was just storing it on a SAN, and it didn't need encryption because the SAN was right beside it. Yeah. And then of course it goes across here. And in this case, the customer said, we don't trust this link in the middle. So what did they do? They put this VPN or IPsec tunnel over it. I don't know, does it need it? Data's SSL. Data's encrypted. The actual key is over here. So when you're looking at this, you kind of look at, and the way I break these things down is your first step is you lump everything into a basket that can't be really well tuned to zero trust. Those things which were never designed to be cloud friendly. They don't use identity very well. They are heavily based on the fact that you have old systems right out of the 80s or 90s, and they say, guess what? I didn't have security. We just sort of file-based permissions, whatever the case is, and we're going to expect that our everything is all going to be fine. So you kind of do that, and then you can put in some of the protections there, and then you go and you look at the other portions, which are more modern types of applications, or more modern types of services, entities, and you secure them. Does a storage space understand your credentials? Of course it does. It's identity-based. It has role-based access. It has role-based access how you manage it. It has permissions on how the data is accessed. You've got a key vault, so it obviously looks at how that data should be unencrypted. Obviously, even if the data is unencrypted here in the whole, the data itself is encrypted. So, maybe it's got to go back to another encryption layer. So when you're looking at these kind of real world scenarios, you take these things and you kind of do that. And let me show you case study number 2 that I did recently. Now, this is another organization that has some sensitive data. And in this kind of sensitive data, they ended up having customers want to access something through another cloud. Oh my God, that AWS group. We can't talk about them. But guess what? They chose, in this case, an application which is another provider because they said, hey, it's a SaaS service. Great, it's all secure. Well, now, not only are you relying on everything that's in Azure, because Microsoft, you have to trust them, your services are running there. In this case, they have APIM and their identity. I haven't even talked about that you obviously are using Enter, which runs inside of Azure and all that stuff. But you also now are looking at another SaaS platform. You know that SaaS platform, how well are they protecting the data? Do they protect it the same way you think you need it? Should you be encrypting stuff as it goes through their environment? Can you do that? Because maybe they need to manipulate it. These are all the questions that most people do. In this case, I ended up having a relatively unsuccessful consulting project because they just looked at it and said, oh, it's on the network, and so it's got to be secure. They were very network centric oriented. And I told them good luck. And that's, and of course, the data kind of flows through here. So, when you're looking at those things, again, you just need to put stuff around it and identify which components need to be inside the castle. And sometimes you have to have a castle. I'm not saying don't have castles. I'm not even saying don't have moats. Just saying understand what you need to protect and how you can protect it. And guess what? You have to protect it with the tools that you're given. If it's a SaaS platform, let's call it Office 365, you have to use that permissions model. If you're protecting a third-party SaaS, you have to use them, that model. Sometimes you can interfere in the middle. Does that do you any good? Yeah. One of the best ways of doing these things, though, is to make sure that your hygiene is good with MFA. Again, making sure that your identities are well managed, making sure that the people up here are accessing it are clean, because, how do you know that the data, when it flows through this, doesn't get back to your database on premise and it's just crap in and crap out? In this case, they went to the system and put stuff in and put bad data. Yeah, that's coming back to that CIA, right? Integrity of your data. Yeah. Are you the person that should have put that data in there? So just coming back and recapping, identity. It's really the cornerstone of Microsoft's security model. After you get identity working well, and the more you can do about that, with all the things I've talked about, MFA, yeah, Microsoft will tell you about this, or mild about it. RBAC and policy, again, relatively straightforward. Understanding your application. Most people don't have an end-to-end understanding of their application and where that traffic goes and which things they should look at. Let me give you a good example. Everyone says, oh, I'm not going to trust my Megaport link because it's, The Megaport devices sit right beside the Microsoft devices. And they say, yeah, but that's on the open internet. It's the smallest internet section you can probably get. It's a piece of wire, fiber optic, or whatever the case is. So maybe that's not the one you should focus on, or maybe not spend all your energy on it. There's probably bigger holes to do, right? And so it's kind of about plugging the big holes. Again, implementing operations, monitoring, maintaining your security posture, and then kind of always be alert. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. So questions? Come on. Everyone understood everything I said. No?
Plus something. I've had this view of zero trust, of it being, I have a network that possibly is treated as unsecured, whether it's the client network or the internet or from work from home or whatever. And that every time I connect to a particular resource, I'm establishing a circuit, a connection by security, authentication, encryption, all that sort of thing. Is that, am I on the right track there? Is that,
That's one element, but it's not every element. And that's the problem, is that everybody, all of these vendors love to talk about their tool and say that's zero trust. There's a whole term in here that is called ZTNA, Zero Trust Network Architecture. But how do I know if I put two things on the same network that I should trust those end devices? My model in the beginning started off from the fact that I secured those endpoints. So even me, I gave you a model and then said, guess what? I'm going to assume, what they say when you assume, that those are secured. And then I went back and you saw that I had, hey, something else is not secure. But absolutely, you have to start and have a clean slate to begin with. So, that's where conditional access comes into place. And Microsoft has this new MS Entra Secure Access, which establishes a tunnel and, all the things. But yeah, is the data on my USB stick secure as I walk down the street? Sure. It's not secure. Maybe if I don't have it encrypted, maybe if I'm logged. But so in that regards, that encryption or that authentication, kind of from a network layer, is just one element. Maybe you talked about two devices. Are you the person that should be accessing it? Is that the device? Is it clean? Has it been injected? These are what conditional access does, right? And then you go deep into those things. Maybe if it's a medical scanner, maybe it's really not easy to scan it for viruses or for being infected because it's got, not that, capable for doing that. So, okay, you kind of give it a higher rating of saying it's okay to be on the network without necessarily being up on its, Defender antivirus or whatever the case is. Yeah. This is my phone. You should scan it every time I connect because I just put my phone everywhere.
I think a lot of people see security as just getting in the way as well. So it's difficult to kind of enforce these sort of things on users, and it's just maddening.
100%, 100%. And so when you look at all the papers, a risk-based approach, people overblow it. Is this data something that could be accessed? How sensitive is the data? Everybody always overestimates the importance of their own data. So, all my data is super secure. I can't have it, But then, of course, we see all the different leaks that happen on the news every night, it seems like, right? Any other questions? Come on. You guys have been totally just sitting back.
I trust you.
Don't trust me. Yeah.
I'll keep going. I'm interested in your views on, trusting systems that are in between our, a network on-prem to Azure, particularly the Express route. I had a customer that we put in the Express route, and they're pretty robust. I think at the time Microsoft weren't actually encrypting Express routes. I don't know what it's like now, but they were insistent on putting in the VPN just like we got there.
Yeah.
I'm overlaying that on top of
an express route. I'm like, this just seems so redundant, especially when the application communication is SSL as well, or TLS as well.
Yeah,
Just layer upon layer. And is there a point at which you say, hang on a minute?
I think
Too many
I
layers.
think that point that you should question everything is in the beginning. In fact, it should be, instead of being zero trust, it should be question everything. We shouldn't call it zero trust. It should be just question everything. Because you're 100% right. There's a lot of applications. In fact, most applications have the capability to encrypt the data as it, if it's set up properly. Yeah, and I see customers, and I see people all the time who, put too much stuff on encryption upon encryption, and I'm like, what's the value of this? Okay, like, is that where a attacker is going to really try to get access to your data, or are there other places that they're going to get access to? And by the way, the number one element that Microsoft has identified for getting attacked is a password spray. Who has a complex password? Yeah. Me? Some passwords, some not passwords. But man, everywhere I go, I try to get MFA. I wish my bank probably that's not. How many people have their bank that does MFA? Okay.
Well,
Like all you
sometimes,
other people? No. Right?
only sometimes, as banks don't do MFA all the time.
Yeah.
It's only if it thinks it needs MFA.
Yeah. That's right.
Certain actions. That was my point about, users getting overloaded with security. I was they enforced some passwordless, the previous place I was working at, and you had to set up a PIN.
Yep.
To activate the Windows Hello or whatever on your machine, and the PIN was alphanumeric. I'm like, hang on a minute, the requirement. I'm like, this is too many layers, and I don't have to put the PIN in too often because the Windows Hello would, fingerprint or Face ID.
And so coming back to that, that's where, as security specialists, you look at something and say, security shouldn't necessarily hinder to the extent the business and it being enabled and getting stuff done. I mean, security should be something that protects the business and provides value. So the data, the release of this data costs, what does it cost me if the data is released? Zero. Does it do anything to do with my reputation? No. Just publish it. Let people have access to it. If it's high value, guess what? Then you put more things in it, right? Oh my God, this is my health records. Maybe MetaBank should have thought about that. Sorry, I said that out loud too much, and I brain it. But I'm just pointing out that that's the kind of thing that you should be worried about, right? And most people are, I see a lot of security specialists, a lot of security papers that are really just not thinking things through that way.
I follow a few of the sort of dark web informer type accounts on Twitter, and the amount of breaches of Fortune 500 companies that have come from the Snowflake system in the last 3 months is astounding.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's some multi-billion dollar companies having major data breaches. Surprisingly, not too many of them are. You sort of see in the general news here, unless it's an Australian company, but there's some massive companies that are using, different cloud-based technologies, and they're just leaving their data out there for anyone to grab, basically.
And two elements of that. Maybe it's a zero-day attack. Maybe it's an unpatched system. Mm-hmm. Those are perhaps less frequent than hackers just getting a password spray and trying, your known passwords. What I think, again, in this password paper, that MFA paper that Microsoft has, and I've got a reference in there, and that is I think it's 78 or 80 something % of all passwords that people have are known to hackers because they're already out there. They're already leaked. Your password is likely to be leaked already. Anyone? Password at 1, 2, 3. Pass that word.
This is more kind of personal related than company related. But one of the things that I don't think a lot of people who are not technically savvy understand is that they might hear that such and such got breached and such got breached and that. And it's not just the sharing of passwords, but it's the amalgamation of personal data in that they think, this one I didn't have my credit card details. This one only had my name and address, phone number, and birthday. It's like, oh, great, everything you need to,
Absolutely.
to steal your identity. They can do, a lot worse with that than they can do with a credit card number that the bank's probably going to pick up fraudulent activity on in about 10 minutes. So, it's the amalgamation of all these things. And, especially if you're sharing a password, that, it's, if you're using it for Facebook and your Gmail, chances are you're using it for your bank account as well. So,
Yeah.
it's that escalation of and combination of data being put together.
Correct. So I'm less worried about most of the systems when people go through it in a bit of a methodical way about whether you're encrypting the transit of some of these things over an express route. I've not necessarily heard too much that this has been a real big point of attack. It's pretty narrow. It's these other areas that are so easy and ripe that are just totally wrong. And that's why, MFA, Microsoft, there shouldn't be any, but I wish the government would just enforce MFA and
On MFA, so most of the interactions, as you said, with the portal would be MFA authenticated, where you use the app.
absolutely.
System to system MFA. How does that typically work in a Microsoft world when it's
Yeah, managed identities. Literally the managed identity. So an MFA is something, the extra authentication is something you are, something you know, something you have, what have you. So that could be a certificate. So mutual TLS is another way of an MFA.
so it's certificate for the most?
Could be a certificate. That's one way. Obviously, let's look back at network-centric security. Because I'm on the network, I trust you. That, and generally speaking, would be your second factor. The question is it a good factor? Right. But, and my point is it a factor that inhibits my business? So great, go back to 2019, pre-pandemic, you can't get access, you're in the office. Now it's pandemic time and I've punted you all onto home and now you can't get access. Why? Because I don't trust your dirty network. I certainly don't trust mine at home. So the fact is that's your second factor gone. So what do? Then you have SMS or, 100%. And so system to system. And so every time you look at two things, entities, whether it's a person, whether it's a service, whether it's a device, it talks to something else. Even processes internally, right, of the system. Now, everybody codes things, and you have all these developers do stuff, and they say, hey, what? I'm going to code this and transfer this API inside of my system. They kind of all assume that they're trusted. Then you end up with what? Containerization and distributed systems, and then you're back into that.
So you'd also put like something like OAuth to, into this mix as well, right?
Absolutely.
When you have APIs talking to APIs or apps talking to
Correct.
APIs or apps to apps or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. And those absolutely are valid, especially if they're with external parties. Maybe you're inside, you may be comfortable from a risk-based approach to relax that. If you're doing high frequency trading, let's say you're an application of high frequency trading, you don't want encryption. You should want things running as fast as possible. Encryption takes time. Verification is slow. These things are difficult. But don't forget, computers pretty fast. Everyone has an NVIDIA chip now, so you can just sail through all this stuff. But the fact is, this is as we do things, security is an overhead. Is it a valid overhead? Absolutely. Is it valid for your situation? Maybe. Most people generally sort of lean one way or the other, and they get that wrong.
Well, Microsoft have started in Microsoft 365, like mailboxes and stuff. You've basically, when you set up a tenancy anymore, you can't turn off the security defaults like you used to be able to.
Yeah.
So within 14 days, everyone has to turn on MFA.
Yeah.
And granted, the people that ring you and say, I don't want to turn this on because it's such a security hassle, are usually the people who are reusing the same password everywhere. So are the people that probably should have it turned on. But, I think it's fantastic now that you just, especially from our point of view, because when I'm talking to my customers who are setting up tenancies, they're like, oh, I don't want this. I'm like, well, you really should. They're like, I don't want to turn it off. And before you could turn it off. Now I can just say, sorry, tough. But I can't.
And so both the great thing that Microsoft has as an industry power, the ability to mandate a standard, and basically you have to accept it.
Yeah.
And that's good. It also feels frustrating.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, you know, how well do you like kind of leave your baby and you kind of put it out on the sidewalk and expect nobody to take it? Or you just, maybe I'll leave my wallet downstairs on the sidewalk and see if nobody, you know. If I was in Singapore, by the way, fantastic. No one would take my wallet. You put it on the train. I used to live in Singapore. It's fantastic. You know, no one would take it. Here, oh God. Sorry. But that's the risk-based approach, right? And I think it's good that they are enforcing these things. On the other hand, as others have noted here, it can be very frustrating sometimes. We need to live in a new world, a better world that is maybe some of these things kind of fade in the background and they're more ubiquitous. Maybe we find out systems where we can trust it. I mean, I don't understand why everyone, politicians particularly, are worried about government IDs and like, why do I want to have all these other things? Just give me the government ID and let me authenticate and have everything use that. It's fantastic.
Oh, the government typically tend to go on the, well, we'll just hit the companies that have data breaches with a big stick,
Which is wrong.
and
I mean, it wouldn't it be great if we just kept all of our credit card details and all those things for the government, and then when your, let me just go back to old school, video store or something, and wanted your credit card, wanted to just authenticate to it and say, "Grip me, fantastic, I'll have that subscription," and they don't have to keep my credit card details. My credit card details seem to be everywhere, right? And that is super frustrating because what business ever wants to delete your data? And then what government, state government agency or council ever wants to delete your data? And do they manage it well enough? Yeah. That's why I like having a bad memory.
that's quite interesting because I remember reading an article, something of it was just after one of these data breaches, and the government were rallying about, companies shouldn't keep data that's no longer relevant more than X number of years or whatever. The following day, I logged into my EasyReg system to look at the registration of my car. There was a car on there that I haven't owned in about 25 years.
Yep, 100%.
And so, why? Well, what could you possibly need that information for?
But not only that, this is the big challenge. Again, one of the examples there, looking at that data, they kept on backing this stuff up, and their dates go back 30 years for these things, right? So, as they go through and ingest it and try to take that data and cleanse it, I mean, you can't, the right to be forgotten in GDPR is next to impossible, because if your data is there somewhere, is it accessible? Maybe, maybe not, but yeah.
But from a database developer point of view, data is never ever deleted.
Yeah.
It's there somewhere. As a database developer, you're paranoid about backups and restorations. then you got the backups of the servers and the restoration of the servers onto tapes, and it will never disappear.
So
I should desperately want to recover it.
But coming back to one question, the point is, well, why do people have encryption or public encryption? Because the infrastructure team doesn't trust the apps team to actually make sure that their SSL is working. And then whatever the case is, right? Anyways, I will switch the presentation.